Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the Indigenous Art Intensive Speaker Series. We're here today with another keynote offering, and thank you for joining us. We have already included two other keynotes previous to today's keynote with Dr. Jolene Rickard, and those are available still on the YouTube with Liane Badamaso Sake Simpson and Bonaventure Ndikang. So please check those out. So the Indigenous Art Intensive is brought to you by UBC Okanagan, and I want to acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is in the unceded territory of the Seal people. I'm joining you today from Secwepemc-Utluk as we're all streaming in from different Indigenous territories, including those which these online platforms have as a physical footprint in different Indigenous territories. So I encourage us all to develop relationships, stand with communities, and do the work that's needed beyond the land acknowledgement to really develop relationships and work together to begin to unwind the injustice that we see around us. The Indigenous Art Intensive is also working with 9 artists in residence, and I just want to acknowledge those artists in residence who've been working with us. This is our final keynote presentation, and we've had a series also of webinars. There will be one more webinar coming up on Monday, and we've certainly enjoyed the conversations that so many Indigenous artists, scholars, curators have offered in this program. I want to also take a moment to thank Collective Broadcast, who's been working with us to do a lot of the tech and the live stream. So thank you so much for making this smooth for myself and for presenters. As well as I really want to thank my graduate research assistants, Brittany Reitzel, Michaela Bridgemohan, and undergraduate research assistant Mara Tomez, who have worked with me tirelessly to put on an online program. Normally we have an in-person Indigenous Art Intensive program, and we've shifted, as many people have, to this format. And I'm so glad that we were able to still work together and still have these critical conversations. So thank you, everyone who's been involved in that. I also want to welcome viewers here today who are with the Contingencies of Care residency with Ontario College of Art and Design University, and thank the co-organizers for that residency who are joining us as well as continuing a residency online throughout June. So welcome, everybody. And I want to introduce our panelist, who many of you know in her critical work and voice, and I'm so excited to present here today. Dr. Jolene Rickard is a visual historian, artist, and curator interested in the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and contemporary art, materiality, and eco-criticism, with an emphasis on Haudenosaunee aesthetics. A selection of publications includes Diversifying Sovereignty and the Reception of Indigenous Art in Art Journal 76 in 2017, Aesthetics, Violence, and Indigeneity in Public 27 from Winter 2016, Arts of Dispossession in From Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic, Landscape Painting in the Americas at the Art Gallery, published by the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2015. The Emergence of Global Indigenous Art at Sakahan, National Gallery of Canada in 2013, and Visualizing Sovereignty in the Time of Biometric Sensors in the South Atlantic Quarterly, Sovereignty, Indigeneity, and the Law in 2011. Recent exhibitions include the Minneapolis Institute of Art's National Exhibition, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists from 2019 to 2021, the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, Art for a New Understanding, Native Voices, 1950s to Now, on exhibition 2018 to 2020. And she co-curated 2 of the 4 inaugural exhibitions of the National Museum of the American Indian from 2004 to 2014. Jolene is on the editorial board of American Art, a founding board member for the Otsego Institute for Native American Art, and an advisor to GRACAC, the Great Lakes Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Culture. Jolene was a 2020 Fulbright Research Scholar at McMaster University in Ontario, and an associate professor in the Department of History of Art, and the former director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program from 2008 to 2020 at Cornell University, Ithaca, New York. Jolene is from the Tuscarora Nation, Turtle Clan, Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Please join me in welcoming this keynote, which I'm so pleased to offer all of us here a chance to listen to. Dr. Jolene Rickard.
Traskanaha Sego, Nyawa to Tanya for the invitation to talk with this very impressive group of artist residents. And thank you to Scott, who helped with me with the technology. So thank you very much. I'm Jolene Rickard, Yachinite, and I am from the Tuscarora Nation, which is located in Western New York. And we have this really complicated story. And so I think that, that's what today is all about in my discussion, is thinking about the complications. And so I'll just share with you that so many people in our communities began their careers or their life experience through making. Sometimes you think of it as making art. Sometimes you think of it as expressive culture. Other times we're contributing to what some people might call tradition. And in my experience, I have not drawn hard boundaries between the production of visual thought and the production of written thought or verbal thought. It's all in some way for me interconnected. And I also have not put up boundaries or restrictions in the way in which I express these ideas. And so sometimes I'm making artistic statements about an idea. Sometimes I'm researching and writing about it with the intent of inching the historic record forward, balancing history in some way. Sometimes I'm thinking about it in an immersive curatorial experience. And so I bring all of these things together based on a very considered understanding of history, and also the contemporary issues that Indigenous peoples face within the context of settler states in a global condition. And so I thought I would share the kind of circuitous path that I've taken in my career. It served me immensely that I actually studied at the undergraduate level graphic design. In fact, this has been one of the most important factors in my curatorial practice, because I really have a sense of spatial relationships and how to create immersive experiences, and to create something also that begins to transcend our individual ways in which we see things, but to communicate. And so this is one of the installations that was a collaboration, curatorial collaborative project with Gabi Tayak, who was an insider curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is now part of the Smithsonian Institution. I brought this one installation forward because it was, I thought it was consistent with the discourse of care, this idea of reflection, this particular moment that we're in today, a call to the people. It's actually a panel that detailed the actions of sovereignty at that period of time. And I coupled the piece that Rebecca Belmore did, a photograph of the piece, with actual conch shells that were also another form of calling within Hawaiian Indigenous space. And so the museum purchased the rights to reproduce the photograph of Belmore's piece, and it was set in dialogue with these actual physical conch shells. But the bigger picture, the bigger story of looking at how our peoples have consistently moved through time is really what this piece of the installation or exhibit was about. But I wanted to share with you something a little closer to my own upbringing. And that's the formation of the Native American Center for the Living Arts, or the Turtle, in Niagara Falls, New York, which only had a short life in terms of its operation, 1981 to 1990. And you can see here, it's situated, it's a Dennis Sun Roads building. It actually has the kind of features of a turtle, and you can see where it's situated on the land right next to Niagara Falls, this aerial view. But why I'm bringing this up is that it was so important to have an example of somebody from my community at Tuscarora. His name is Duff Wilson, and he was the person, the driving force behind making this center happen. And it happened in 1981, which is a little, this is a little bit of, time. And it was a place to celebrate Haudenosaunee culture. And so I would argue the revitalization or awareness of Haudenosaunee culture, for me, really was anchored in the work that was being done at the Turtle. I see the larger time frame of the revitalization of our traditions in our communities having a slightly earlier moment in the 1970s. But it's just a question of how we frame these experiences, because, and what I'm showing you right now is the way in which it happened in the 1800s for the Haudenosaunee, and in particular the Tuscarora people. And so I'm showing a photograph of one of the Tuscarora women at the brink of the falls. Of course, at this period of time, the language that is in the card, I think, is probably something that is an artifact of that period of time, but nonetheless, it should be noted that it's unacceptable language in many spaces today. And this form of raised beadwork is a kind of innovation that happened, and I would argue the Tuscarora excelled at this. And how I see this beadwork is actually in two different ways. One, it actually confirms an aspect of our oral histories, the symbolic or iconic language within the beadwork, confirms a number of the concepts that we learn about in our teachings. But then two, it's also about economic resilience. And so people in our communities in the late 1800s actually developed excellent marketing strategies and translations of our artistic strengths into saleable items. For the Tuscarora, it was primarily because it was a period of time in North America when society was moving from an agrarian state to an industrial state, and our people were not included in that modernization. We couldn't get bank loans, we couldn't modernize our farms, we couldn't capitalize or monetize our land. And so we were, in a sense, shut out of economies. And so this was one of the most robust strategies, I would argue, throughout North America that most Indigenous people engaged with. And so this insight actually led to an exhibition that I'm going to argue really changed the way that peoples in our communities understood beadwork. It's called Across Borders Beadwork in Iroquois Life. And it was done with a collaborative team. But the important part, I think, of me sharing this with you is that in Haudenosaunee territories at that period of time, beadwork was not considered a celebrated art. It was something that happened within the family. It was adored and loved as something to receive a gift, but it wasn't something that was equal to the other kinds of art production that were happening in our territories at that period of time. And so now this is where I switch gears and think about this from a historian's perspective, in that the question I have is that I would love, if I had all the time in the world, I would love to talk and find out from other communities, people who are engaged in analyzing cultural production, if there's a gendered bias in the production of beadwork in their communities at that period of time. And so one of the things that I recognize is that we do have to kind of take ourselves to task and recognize how far we've come, how things have become better. But we also have to be very, I think, honest with ourselves about what they were like, even within our own communities, as it relates to gender bias. And so when we curated Across Borders Beadwork in Iroquois Life, one of the things that we did in this exhibit is we specifically focused on the celebration of not only the form of beadwork, but that most of the makers were women and are women. And so a photo installation was accompanied the exhibit that was installed in the form of a woman's skirt when the exhibit was featured or mounted near the Tuscarora Nation at the Castellani Art Museum. But since that period of time, what I see is that there's just been an incredible proliferation and confidence with the use of beadwork as part of an artistic practice. Shelley Nero's work was included in the exhibit at that period of time. Her Thinking Cat series was featured, but I'm presenting a contemporary, a more recent piece of hers that demonstrates just the continued robust nature in which artists today continue to map and reinvent beadwork in our communities. And so the Across Borders Beadwork in Iroquois Life actually opened up the opportunity for me to become part of the curatorial collaborative teams at the National Museum of the American Indian. And what you're seeing right now are installations that I did in collaboration with Paul Chat-Smith, who was a curator inside of the museum. And this is what Paul and I euphemistically called the colonization machine. We looked at the impact of gold, guns, Bibles, and treaties as a way of thinking through how things changed irrevocably at contact. And of course, contact is at different points in the Americas, in the hemisphere. And so there were different actions that took place at different times. The exhibit received a great deal of criticism. Often the criticism was most harsh from other Indigenous scholars. But one of the things that I will stand by is that this exhibit was not meant to detail the cosmological, historic, or material analysis of individual pieces. But the intent of using multiples as a strategy to communicate a larger concept is what was in play here. And so when we look at all the ceramic figures, what we're looking at is all of the voices of people that we can no longer hear from because their cultures were erased due to multiple forms of genocide at contact, with, of course, germ genocide being one of the most dominant forms of impact at contact. And so when we think about what's happening in our communities today, we actually have a great deal of experience and quite a long lens on what it takes to survive this kind of germ genocide. And so these pieces, these ceramic pieces, together accumulatively tell a much larger story than if we are to delve deep into each of the cosmological historic histories of each of these pieces. And so the intent of this exhibit was to actually have a database that could provide further detail on each of these objects, which never actually materialized due to funding. The gold wall, of course, received a great deal of attention. And so all kinds of metrics were conducted on the reception of this exhibit when it was installed. And by metrics, the way in which the museum looks at the effectiveness of an exhibit, one of the ways was that it had cameras situated throughout the museum, and it would analyze the amount of time and the number of visitors that would engage with each of the exhibits. And so the gold wall actually, people spent the most amount of time at it. And it actually, at some points in the early years of the exhibit, was the most visited installation on the Museum Mall in Washington, D.C., which I think absolutely bears further analysis. The particular images or the particular objects in the gold wall pay homage to the relationship that Indigenous peoples in Central America held to gold, as well as South America. And then, of course, part of the gold wall also featured objects which were in transition or had been smelted down in order to be translated then into objects of European design. I think the gun wall is fairly obvious, the impact of war that took place in the Americas. We didn't take our colonization sitting down. It was actually something that all of our communities resisted. And it was actually an incredibly violent moment that has never really been fully understood in the Americas. But the easiest part of this exhibit to curate was actually the actual wall on Bibles. And that within 10 minutes, we were able to identify hundreds of Bibles that had been translated into Indigenous languages. And so I'm sorry I don't have a photo of the treaty installation, but treaties are the law of the land in at least the United States. Treaties are not our laws. And so treaty is a really complicated space. But one of the things that I've been watching very carefully is the movement of Indigenous art into a global context. And one of the early experiences that I had with this was that the actual invitation to attend one of the Encentro's events in Belo Horizonte, which is actually in Brazil, but the organization was actually located through New York University. And so this experience really began to put on my radar, how is it we're going to understand ourselves as Indigenous peoples in a global context? And I have to say that, we're all at a very different point at this period of time. But at that moment, it was still like we were beginning to understand how to bring this discussion to an international and now, as we would describe it, a global level. But at the same time, I've always been very attentive to the specific framing and ongoing framing of Indigenous cultures with a kind of like a specific framework. And this is where I looked. I think the work of Ryan Rice, the exhibit that he curated, Also Iroquois, was really important at that moment in time. It's interesting because Ryan and I both acknowledge that a number of our colleagues were widely critical of a culturally specific Indigenous exhibit, as if it were in some way provincial. And this, I think, is one of the important tensions that we all have to consider in our practice today. If we don't take care of the cultures that we come from, then what will it be in the future? And I have to trust, I think I really have to be respectful to and trust that there's something really important in the cultural knowledge that each of us inherit from the cultures that we come from that really needs to be held whole. And I take inspiration from the Maori on this point. And most recently, an amazing exhibit has come together in Aotearoa or New Zealand that is a specifically Maori focused exhibit organized by Nigel Borrell. It's again a kind of ongoing dedication that the Maori have to continuing to investigate and continuing to experience, to represent their particular way of understanding the world. And I think each one of us has that responsibility in the cultures that we come from. And so this sharing the work of Tatihi, which is a gathering that takes place every year, sometimes every other year, with the primary focus on building relationships between the Maori and other Pacific Rim Indigenous peoples in the Americas in particular. There's been a great deal of contact with Indigenous peoples in the Northwest Coast. And so it's about recentering. This project has been about recentering how we understand ourselves and our relationships in the arts. It's Indigenous peoples. The particular focus of Te Maori is to promote the knowledge invested in making what people would call traditional forms or customary forms, the actual skill set needed to actually carve, the skill set to weave, the skill set to know fibers, to know when to harvest things, etc. That deep knowledge is really part of the making process. And this is something that I feel that as artists, we are all responsible to. And yet at the same time, I think that our impact in global settings like the Venice Biennale are equally important. And so what's kind of really fascinating to me is how rapidly change has occurred within the past 25 years. That we have Indigenous artists that are being that are legible, that are visible as Indigenous in international settings like the Venice Biennale. And at the same time, we're confident enough to continue to drill down and really understand the cultural spaces that we come from individually. And so I think it would be important then to share how I put that together for myself. And I apologize for sharing a map with you, but some of you may not be as familiar with Haudenosaunee territories as you are with your own. And so I'm going to share this particular map because at one point in time, the Haudenosaunee would have perceived or would have claimed that most of what you're seeing in this map would be within their understanding of what they call the one dish, one spoon wampum. And so now you can see just these little tiny dots of where our communities are located today. And so when people talk about Indigenous futurity, what is the image? What is the idea that we have in mind? And so the idea that I have in mind is that my people are in it for the long haul. And so New York State, the United States, Canada, we don't know. It might come and go. But I think we have the ability to transcend current political structures if we take care of and maintain those teachings that our ancestors laid out for us and that we are now responsible for the caretakers and practitioners of. And so we have arrived in the 21st century, coming from, inheriting cultural spaces that have been together for thousands of years. There really aren't that many people, that many cultures in the world that have the same kind of longevity. There are many indigenous peoples in the world that can actually make this same statement. And so this is what I feel that we're doing in our arts practices, in our intellectual practices, in our community practices, is that we are really trying to continue understanding how it is that we have arrived at this place with the knowledge that we have. And so I think it's a huge responsibility. And so in the early 20th century, within my family, I understand what actions they took so that in the 21st century, I can still be here as a Tuscarora and as a Haudenosaunee person. Because I think none of this is guaranteed for us. And so our people had to stand up and they put their bodies in spaces and made clear that we're not erased, that we're not part of a vanishing paradigm, that we are discrete and separate governments, however it is those governments are articulated. I acknowledge today the debate around notions of governance, and so we need to kind of put brackets around this and allow ourselves some time to really think through what these cultural formations continue to be. And so for the Haudenosaunee, we actually began to formalize our understanding in relationship to settler states. We really began to understand and use the language of sovereignty as a way to do this. Our ancestors created the red card, and on the red card, they articulated all of these relationships. And it wasn't just a relationship to the settler state of the United States or the settler state of Canada, but it was actually to both. Because even at this point in time, there was an absolute consciousness that our territories transcended these recent nation state borders and that we must maintain this awareness. And so we see here an organization that my grandfather, Clinton Rickard, was instrumental, and also my grandmother, Elizabeth Rickard, were instrumental in forming and supporting And this organization continues to this day. And the function of this organization is actually to bring people together around the Jay Treaty of 1794. And it's actually in that treaty that we see the United States recognizing our right as Haudenosaunee people to move freely in our homeland. And so this is one of the bases for the argument for nationhood amongst the Haudenosaunee. And this is my grandfather in this buckskin suit. And so in other lectures with more time or other seminars, workshops, I talk about the shift in how our people represented themselves in the early 20th century versus how our people think we dressed historically. And so another incredibly formative experience for me was the dispossession of this part of the Tuscarora Nation for one of the largest hydroelectric projects in North America. And here again, you could see my Uncle William, Mad Bear Anderson, and Elvis Hewitt marking our space and saying we're going to resist, we're going to stand up. And in fact, Alvin Josephi recognized that the Tuscarora were amongst one of the first peoples, indigenous nations in the 20th century that had to stand up to defend itself against further dispossession because they wanted more of our community than they got. They got some of it, and it's not a good story, but it was definitely part of the ongoing dispossession of land from indigenous peoples in North America, particularly the United States, by the US Army Corps of Engineers. And it was a particular strategy. And so this photograph was actually taken at the Tuscarora Nation in 1971. But inside all of this has been the Tuscarora dedication to growing. And it's interesting because I didn't grow up with the language of food sovereignty, but my family was absolutely practicing it. In fact, it's been quite difficult for me to adjust to the rhetoric of food sovereignty or any of the rhetoric of any of the kinds of sovereignty people are expressing if there actually isn't a practice associated with it. And so within my family and the Tuscarora people at large, we take very seriously our responsibility to bring the heritage seeds from one generation to the next. We don't have a seed bank where we hold the seeds. Our seed bank is that we actually grow these crops every single year, and that we make sure that we have enough to feed the people, to feed people that ask us for help, and to also plant for the future seasons. And so there's a very deep discussion about what food sovereignty means when you're actually a community that's practicing it. And so I make work about that. And I have to share with you again one of these like odd things, because I think everybody has glossed over some of these issues. In that when I made the Corn Blue Room, I received wide criticism from people in my own community, because in the Haudenosaunee community at large, because they didn't really think connecting corn to the impact of the dispossession of our community because of the hydroelectric project, that was really making art, or that our corn had anything to do with it. But this idea of continuing these traditions or continuing these practices and knowing how to continue to make these things and grow these things, I think is really one of the most critical skills that we have today. For me, the making art part of it was confirming that skill. And so that's where I made a secondary piece called the cornbread room, because making this kind of cornbread takes an enormous amount of skill, and it takes, I think, a generation of people to actually maintain these seeds to continue these practices. And so I put my thoughts into visual, but I put them also into practice. And so I'm now living within the ancestral territory of the Gayakono, or the Kyuga nation. And what I'm showing is where the Kyuga lived historically before. These are all their villages for 10,000 years before they were forcibly displaced by the Clinton-Sullivan expedition of 1779, which today has been recognized as a burnt earth campaign against the Haudenosaunee that was actually authorized by Hunnit de Gaius, or village burner, or the name that we have given whatever sitting president is in for the United States. At that period of time, it was George Washington. And so it's kind of interesting to me that Cornell University actually has in their archive, the original map of the campaign to dispossess our people. I don't know, I just think that's a really horrifying yet interesting fact. Of course, this has been put into bronze on signposts throughout New York State. These are incredibly important things to understand about how in the United States we are still not being taken. The impact of that moment is seen as something that is a victory for the United States, and it's not taken into consideration that these signs are offensive to the Haudenosaunee people, and that we really need to now rethink how this space is marked historically, how it is, and then what the history of that means and how it's represented today. And so there's over 32 different signs around Kyuga territory, and the Kyuga were forcibly displaced from this land at that moment in time. They then were sheltered in a number of our communities. I grew up with a large Kyuga population at Tuscarora, but there are a number of people also crossed over the line and went to Brantford at Six Nations. They began, I think, what is one of the most important projects or demonstrations of Haudenosaunee sovereignty in the 21st century. They began to return to their homelands. And what they were met with are these signs: no sovereign nation, no reservation. Local citizens of the United States in the ancestral homeland of the Kyuga people did not welcome them. And so what is the responsibility then of an Indigenous Studies program at a university located within Kyuga territory? And I would argue it's to raise the awareness of the historic actions that took place and began an integral dialogue with the Kyuga Nation in order to meet their needs. And so as a Haudenosaunee citizen, as a Tuscarora woman, I began exercising our own practice of protocol to approach the leadership of the Kyuga Nation and to be asked to work with them to help a population of global citizens at Cornell University, people from all over the world, understand this example of dispossession of relocating to the land. And it's been a really difficult journey that isn't easy. But what has resulted is an incredibly rich experience, a growth of knowledge, because the Kyuga people are one of the peoples in the Confederacy that have held on to the most in-depth understanding of both our ceremonies and language. And when we bring the Kyuga language back to their homelands, we begin to see the direct connection of the words and the stories to place. And so it's been an incredibly rich and rewarding experience to learn this and to actually try to meet their goals of return to their homelands. But of course, nothing is easy. And, you know, they've been very generous with us and welcoming us into their learning center. And this is an inside shot of their learning center, which was bulldozed over by the Bureau of Indian Affairs representative for the Kyuga people. And so this is a much longer and detailed story that Kiowa filmmaker Jeff Palmer and I are collaborating on with the Kyuga Nation, with the Kyuga people, to sort through how it is the paternalistic action of a Bureau of Indian Affairs appointed representative has the authority to bulldoze over the building which represented the cultural center of the return of the Kyuga people. We supported and documented a historic press conference that was taking place. And after the press conference, we surveyed some of the damage. And as we were moving off from the press conference, violence broke out, and the state immediately sent in this kind of police action against the traditional Kyuga people, because all of the people in the black coats are hired militia by the Bureau of Indian Affairs sanctioned representative. And it was an incredibly violent moment. And this is something that we're now trying to support the people who have returned to the land so that they can continue on their journey. And so in collaboration with one of the Kyuga speakers who's trying to resettle the land, I'm working with them and created this piece called Gayakono Return. And it's actually a loan of an 800-year-old canoe that instigated this piece, that a collector I know was able to loan me this canoe. And with the technology skills of a fellow Tuscarora artist, Waylon Wilson, we created a sort of space of the Gayakono Return. And so in this particular piece, we looked at the, incorporated in each one of these pieces is Gayakono language, people of the pipe and people of the swamp. We're using Haudenosaunee iconography. I have the corn, thousands of bushels of corn were destroyed during the Clinton Sullivan campaign. We see the fire, and then we also see the rim, the design that represents the rim of the earth or the edge of pottery. And so you all know that before contact, the canoe was the primary mode of transportation for Indigenous people in North America, in the Americas. And so this piece becomes a kind of signal that the Kyuga are going to return, and we're going to bring with us our culture, and that this place that we think of as the Americas, that this is our home, this is our place. And so how do we, continue to nurture this space and nurture our people to continue on this journey? And so in a sense, our artwork, when we're making art, when we're writing about it, when we're thinking about it, it all becomes part of this kind of continued practice, this memory, this confirmation, reflection. But I think how we do this work, how we're positioned, who we work with, what our own subjectivity is. It was important for me today to tell you about this method that I work within, how I work on these projects, because it takes, this to actually be able to make this one piece, to be able to work on this film took 5 years of relationship building before that space opened up for me to do this work. And so I guess I'm kind of in this reflective mode at this period of time when so many people are stepping into our canoe or representing themselves as bringing some kind of Indigenous knowledge forward. And I want to trust, I really do want to trust that all of these makers are actually bringing something forward for the good of all of us, and not just personal gain. Because the kind of making that I'm interested in actually makes our communities stronger. And when our communities are stronger, I think, as individuals, we're stronger. And so this was the piece that I did for the Hearts of the People exhibit. And it is based on a collaboration with beadworkers from my community. And for anybody that's done collaborative work with people in their communities, you recognize that it's a very time-consuming process. It would have been much easier for me to just commission and buy this work instead of working with the beadworkers to get their consent, get their agreement to participate, get them to sign on for the concept of looking at the demise of the passenger pigeon, which at one point in time was in the millions in our territory, had a reciprocal relationship with the American chestnut tree, and was hunted to exhaustion in the late 1800s. I believe the last bird was identified in 1901 or 1904. And I know this because Cornell actually has, in the Lab of Ornithology, has an archive of all of the taxidermied passenger pigeons that people send to them. So there are like literally hundreds of passenger pigeons, and that's what instigated the photograph. It's actually a photograph of the birds in their archival state in the Lab of Ornithology. But it is, I put it in, I put the loss of their lives, the loss of these birds with, in contrast with the celebration of what the bird represents to us in our culture. And the Tuscarora have had this tradition of beating these birds the birds play an important role in giving thanks or ganonyo. They, of course, are messengers for most Indigenous peoples. They combine both the economy of that I showed you, the beadwork at the turn of the century, and but they're also, I think, a demonstration of this kind of like ongoing vitality of the production of this work. I combine this with the Kyuga pigeon dance songs. So when you approach this piece, you hear a faint, almost haunting soundtrack of the pigeon dance songs. And so it's sort of full circle for me, because after the Tuscarora were dispossessed from North Carolina, this is a much larger story. We were here in Western New York. We argue that this is where we began. We had a journey for 1,000 years in the Carolinas, and then we came home to our northern brother of the Haudenosaunee. And the Tuscarora actually came in through the territory of the Kyuga Nation, or the Gayakono. And it's interesting because now I'm back there and working with their return now to their homeland. And so this piece is a kind of complicated piece that recognizes all of those things. But at the same time, I'm also working to continue my relationship to place. And this is the Planting Moon installation in the early phase. It was planted in Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in the 13 mounds that form the carcass of the back of the turtle, which is our calendar, which is why it's the Planting Moon installation. And then you can see how it's, grown near harvest. And so that's, what I thought I would share with you today, that my practice is complex, and I recognize that your practices are also really diverse. And I hope that there's been something in this that could help to inspire you. So Nyawa.
Thank you so much, Jolene, for really epic talk. Stakuk is collectively we thank you, so I'll extend my thanks from others who I know who are sharing and listening. And yeah, we have a little bit of time for conversation. I do want to invite people who are watching the YouTube live stream that they can, within YouTube, they can comment and leave questions, which will be translated to me. And I'm screening, filtering through those, and I will pose some of them. I can't promise to pose all of your questions, but we will hopefully have some time for some, if there's some folks on there who want to pose any. And then I have this honor and perhaps anxiety of having a conversation with you after what is a really encompassing talk that, again, I just want to say thank you for it. And perhaps the first instigation of conversation as I'm reflecting on the way in which your curatorial, your artistic practice, and the role of the historical as enacted by the contemporary moment and the ongoing political struggles. Those are, not all the time for people working in those different fields are they aligned. Sometimes there's tension between the historical and the contemporary, as maybe you touched on in the reception or the critique, perhaps, with some of the works. And I'm really interested in how you work through those different ways of working, and what vision maybe sustains the way in which you weave in between them.
That's a really good observation, Tanya. It's taken a while to get here, in that I'm a complete supporter of intuition. And I think that you do have to follow your instinct. but that at the same time, I'm also, I think, very supportive of trying to understand how things happened in the past and doing it really suspiciously, very cautiously. Because I think that, one of the greatest skills is to be able to, of course, read against the grain or against the archive. And it takes, I think, a great deal of confidence and skill to be able to do that. And so it requires, I think, that you are in conversation with lots of different communities at the same time. And so I think for me, it's just been so difficult yet rewarding to really try to grapple with what is Haudenosaunee history. That this is, a huge task. But so, I mean, I do, so I guess that's my point today, that each of us has a responsibility to understand our own place, while at the same time trying to set that in dialogue with larger global forces. And so you can't ignore what's happening in how the Chinese have entered the art market. We can't ignore the uptick of the Sami as the indigenous peoples that are sort of like making a space for themselves in the international arena, in particular in spaces like the UN. We can't ignore the complications around what does it mean to be indigenous if you're from Latin America, because I think there's all of these things are incredibly complex, and so how I don't think we've had enough conversation about that yet. I know that there's I think that there's a kind of it's important to include, be inclusive, but I always look at my local experience or my experience in my own community, and when the balance tips with people controlling the dialogue that do not have the same cultural experience that you've had, it really changes where you're going in the future. And so I'm so conscious of what happened to my people in the Tuscarora Wars in the 1713. It was at that moment that my ancestors began this kind of like strategic march forward so that I could even exist today as a Tuscarora. And in so many of our communities, I feel that we've lost that kind of strategic edge and have taken up issues that might not get us to, this adage of 7 generations, right? The future generations. And so I don't know. I don't think that answered your question, but
yeah, I don't know if it has an answer, but your further deliberation and thought process is wonderful. I'm thinking also about parallels across lands, and the image you showed from 1926. We have been covering in some of our classes, and certainly in my classes, I look at the role of declaration made by interior chiefs here, and that was from 1910, but I'm familiar with histories of campaigning against governments for land rights within our nation, and 1926 was one of these years when a delegation went to petition in Ottawa, and previously before that to London. Mm-hmm. And that sustained advocacy, which I think people don't contextualize within the historical period either, to know that earlier delegations would have had to have special arrangements to have train travel. When I was looking into some of the histories, there was like problems with where people might stay because hotels were not open to Indigenous people in Canada.
Right.
Period. And so I think this idea that you touch on through the talk around responsibility and labor, the labor of caring, the sort of unspoken aspects of the real commitment to the work.
Yes.
Artist, as a historian, as a culture keeper, as just a member of your nation, I think is so important. And I don't know if you want to talk further sort of around that, around these kind of relationalities we have, maybe that we have, distinct languages, of course, and cultures across this great expanse of land. But of course, the experience of colonization has also etched these lines of familiarity for us, where we see histories that parallel each other's, and of course through different times. So the colonization, the pressure of colonization in BC, British Columbia, really built from the gold rush period, the late 1800s, early into the 1900s, and so the period of contact has been perhaps truncated. And this is a long, perhaps, question and conversation, but yeah, I'm interested in these aspects of your work about the importance of that labor, and maybe a way to pose it, to bring it back to something more concrete than my rambling, is to think about the beadwork you showed earlier on, and the gendered nature of that work. And it certainly parallels here the realm of basketry. And so I'd love to hear a little bit around that.
Yeah, no, that's such an important, I think it's a really important topic, because, I mean, the transition that all of our communities have had to make at different periods of time has been, I think, just a part of our unmarked history. And I think the more that we make present what the strategies were that our ancestors used, and incorporate that thinking into our work, I think demystifies what it is we do. And I guess that was one of the things that kind of is always the echo in the back of my mind. It's that, I didn't grow up in a situation where there was this idea that any of what we did was in some way mysterious. It was all very practical, and it was very much practiced. And I'm not suggesting that there weren't really special and unexplained experiences, but it wasn't in this kind of way that so many people express it today, that it's this, precious moment, right? And so, so sometimes I have not a hard time, but I guess I just don't recognize the interpretation of other indigenous cultures through a lens of kind of mystery, right? I'm always thinking about, well, how did they really do that? How did that really happen? And even things that I think have a more profound spiritual context, I still think are really practical. And so I'm always looking for exactly how was that done. And so I love the detail that you're calling our attention to, that it wasn't easy to travel there. And so to me, when that, there's an opportunity to actually make a really interesting visual commentary about that, And so I guess that's my point. I've just arrived at this place where I just want everybody to really invest in what happened to us, and to really learn that, instead of kind of mythologizing it, instead of turning it into a mythology, because it's much more interesting when you actually know the details, and how They really, and how smart our ancestors were, how capable they were, and to challenge ourselves to be as capable as they were with the resources they had. And so I would argue that we're all pretty flabby in comparison to our ancestors, you know? And we have to sharpen up if we're going to actually continue. And that's not an easy thing to say or to hear, but I do think that's the truth.
I hear that call though. I hear that, and in some ways we have to work maybe twice as hard, and sometimes we have to learn how to
Yes.
rescue it twice, because there are perhaps not as many of us as there were in our traditional societies at the time when we were
Yeah.
had more abundance. I have a comment and a question here from colleague Candice Hopkins, and so
Oh,
I'm going to go ahead and read that if you'll forgive.
sure.
Uh, Candice says, Jolene, I have thought about the installation that you and Paul Chatt-Smith did at the NMAI ever since I first heard about it. I do think that the Guns, Bibles, Gold, and Treaties was a means to speak about colonial violence and genocide in the Americas. In some ways, reading about the criticism of that installation at the time by mainly non-Native critics, they didn't get the nuances, nor did they get the bigger picture, because many still don't understand how colonialism operates and continues to operate in the US, Canada, and beyond. So Candice says, my question is, was that installation ahead of its time? What can we do and continue to do to counter the amnesia or deliberate forgetting of Indigenous histories?
Thank you, Candice. Thanks for that insight and close reading of that piece. I think there's a certain, hubris to suggest that the installation was ahead of its time, but I think it was. And I think that in America is now just beginning to be forced to deal with enslavement as part of its foundational structure. And so the question for me will be, will they be willing to go deeper and understand colonization as the basis of its formation? And in order to acknowledge colonization, the process of colonization as the formation of the contemporary nation state, it means, that it has to then reflect on its actions of American exceptionalism globally today. And so I don't know what it will take to change this, because I think that before it becomes an equitable space, I think we're going to experience another kind of pressure of dispossession. And what I look at is that our peoples might have resources in their lands. They might have water, they might have lumber, they might just have good soil to grow things from. It might be soil that doesn't need to have water pumped in from thousands of miles away. And so the ability for peoples in our communities to produce food, to take care of themselves might be a really valuable resource. And so as climate change escalates, I think there's going to be increased pressure on Indigenous peoples in coastal regions, but also in well-resourced regions. And so I can't at this moment say confidently that there will be an attitude of equity or justice when it comes to depleted resources. And so I think our people should be preparing for a different time. And I would like to think that learning this history will change the attitudes of settler citizens. But what we're witnessing as it relates to incarcerated and enslaved Black bodies, it's not a hopeful picture. And so I think there are many people trying to think this through, and what our alliances are, what our relationships are. I see the increase in Indigenous Black relationships, alliances. I haven't yet seen a recognition from all settlers of whether they're from communities of color, BIPOC communities in the United States. I haven't really seen a solidarity with, an acknowledgement with, that the lands that they're on are also our lands. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. And however we can curate or make work that begins to at least plant the seeds or open the minds, because, you know, that there has to be a better way to do this, maybe through diplomas, whatever it is, you know. And I know, Candace, that your work has always been directed in this way, but I don't have an affirmative answer that I think it's going to be soon that this changes, this attitude changes.
Thank you. And perhaps I'll use that segue of planting seeds for our next question. We had another question, and perhaps this is a layered question. So this question comes from Ari, who was really inspired by the work you're doing to continue to grow and retain food and seed sovereignty. I found that very inspiring. And they're wondering around, as a settler, is that a practice they can be in solidarity with, fit in with, like maybe in terms of those kinds of Indigenous gardening? There's principles. Is there threads there that can be picked up by others? What parts of that are to be held by individuals, communities, families, and are there parts that people can contribute to? I think is it perhaps the gentlest way I can kind of work around that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And absolutely, I feel that, you know, we can all really raise our knowledge about the kinds of our relationship to these plants. And so sometimes people ask me, like, well, you know, Native cultures really weren't that important. Look, you have no monuments. And of course, you know, and so what I'm going to argue is the plants are actually our monuments. And so our relationship to these plants, which has been developed over thousands of years, is actually that's our monument. And so to pick that work up, you know, as somebody that's living in this place, I mean, like, you know, the Americas are still really an incredible place, you know, that as far as what we have here, it hasn't reached the state of environmental decline that has occurred in other parts of the world because of overuse. And so there's something right about the philosophies that our ancestors developed, that we actually arrive in the 21st century with the spaces that we have, right? The land spaces that we have. And so it's not just about learning about the plants, it's about learning about Indigenous philosophies and not trying to become Indigenous. You know, nobody's asking for people, and I'm sure Ari's not asking that question, but it's not just about the planting, but it's about a philosophy of place that relates to the kinds of things that we're growing, how we're growing them, how we take care of these seeds. And so one of the things in Haudenosaunee territories is that we have seed exchanges, and it's become a really vibrant space. And so there's also a great deal of competition now in it, and it's kind of interesting how it's developed. And so one of again, I just need like a lot of research assistance, because one of the projects I would like to do is to take the seeds that we have that we're calling art seeds and calling them heritage seeds. And I would like to see how many other communities in the Americas actually have those seeds and are growing them and call them something else. And so what we think is really important and have a relationship to could already exist in other places. But it's a shift in our relationship to thinking about what these plants are. And so when we think about like the large agribusinesses, that's, we need to shift away from that. It's actually, complicated, but that's contributing certainly to the drought that's happening in the American Southwest right now. And so, environmentalists are working on this. I recognize that there are a great many people involved in sustainability movements that are thinking about this. But for Indigenous peoples, there's just that wonderful philosophical teachings that give us this sense that these plants are our relatives, that they have certain psychophysical meanings for us. And I guess what Ari's question prompts me to want to think about is, how can we share more deeply across cultural lines without being extracted again? And so I think our people would love to share, but we're extremely cautious, because every time we've stepped into these relationships, it hasn't gone well for us. And so there needs to be more trust built. And what is that trust? Part of that trust is, I think, entrusting us with being the stewards of this land. That's the first and most important acknowledgement that then begins, I think, the other kinds of sharing that could take place. But I don't think it's appropriate to ask for this intimate knowledge relationship without first according the authority of our stewardship of this land. And so I know that that's not an easy thing to hear, but that's how I think. And it might not be how all Indigenous people think, but that's how I think.
Thank you. I want to just affirm that beautiful concept of plants as monuments. I'll just sit with it for a minute. It's very beautiful. I'll just share that it reminds me of the relationship to agriculture that for the largely the interior Salish people, of which Secwepemc and Syilx and Kukwapmuk and Tsilhqot'in are considered in this area, and Lil'wat and Stalo, that at times the kind of anthropological and ethnographic derision of the kind of progress of civilization had us that we didn't practice agriculture as settlers knew agriculture, and so sort of demoted to a lesser state of civilization in that constructed view. But indeed, where I live, up in the mountains and hills, is one of the lowest areas where this particular root plant, which is subalpine, grows. And it blooms in the early spring and colors the hillsides this brilliant yellow. It's a kind of a glacier lily. In our language, it's swiuch. And there's just people look at that and they come and tour the wildflowers or something, and they think of it as, it's all happened on its own, but it's of course this concept of landscape wide agricultural practice.
Yeah.
And so in a very real way, your prompt there of thinking of the plants as monuments makes me think of that beautiful monument on the hillside every spring.
Yeah.
And that idea of the embodying,
Mhm.
the repeated, the cultural
Yeah.
practice, which is extended over time, not just a one time like, oh, plants and gardens are interesting or trendy right now. It's a sustained commitment that has to sustain itself through the unpopular time.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Well, that's the funny part of it, because I was the least likely to go into the garden to weed or to and it's sort of ironic, but what I observe is that you actually have to get children when you have to start when you're a child to actually be able to, I think, continue it as an adult. And so for all the people that are parents, probably one of the most important things you could do is to actually garden with your children or to encourage them to be growers. And I certainly just, had to live that lifestyle because that was the lifestyle I was born into. But and it, and so like for my ancestors, my grandparents and the people around me, if they heard me talking this way about the plants and how it happens, they would probably just laugh at me. Okay. It's, oh, that Jolene, she's always got to make more of it, you know, but they're the ones that were actually the philosophers doing this. I just am now part of like my generation. This is what we do. We extract it and have to philosophize it and have to, discuss it and photograph it and make work of it in order to confirm it, but they just lived it, right? It was just, that's how they lived. And so, I think we have to acknowledge these kinds of things, that I think are the people at least at home would, they would snicker, right? That I'm suggesting this, but that you felt it was important that you could recognize that, yeah, the plants are our monuments. I mean, we have to let ourselves have the big thoughts as well, I think. And so and I think that our ancestors knew these things. They created ceremony, they created lifestyles that actually moved these ideas forward without the theorization of it. And so actually in the 20th century, the 21st century, we're in this mode of the abstraction and theorization as part of the impact of, I think, our connection to other cultures, other ways of being. But we can't just let the abstraction or theorization or philosophizing of it outweigh the actual practice and experience and doing. And this has been a hard lesson in my life, but I'm really trying to correct this balance, and I'm grateful that I can at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Does
absolutely.
that abstraction make sense?
Or what other thing, because perhaps this idea of gold, settler encroachment, extraction, and plants maybe together, which is just that in this earlier declaration I mentioned, it's called the Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial that Interior Chief presented to an important Canadian diplomat at the time that really extended our land rights philosophies and sort of our take on what was happening with colonization. And there's a small moment in it, and I'll have to also thank Elder Chris Marchand and Eric Mitchell, who read the declaration out loud with our class and had us just kind of sit with it and think about it. And there was a moment where Eric's reading that stood out to me where, and I know this memorial, I've read it several times more than several times over my lifetime. I've sort of always known it. But there's a moment where the chiefs in this address say, yes, we know what gold is. We know we have it here in our territory, and we allow you to, to have some of it because we don't need it for our lives. and it just revealed like gold as kind of the, this ultimate standard of extraction.
Mm-hmm.
And exploitation that indeed opened a lot of the settler colonial pathways to British Columbia, which is not British Columbia, but a series of sovereign Indigenous territories, but opened that pathway, and not without conflict, of course. I'm not saying that people said they could have it. It's just like they were affirming that they knew what it was, that there wasn't this assumption that, oh, they don't value it, they're ignorant, they don't know what it is. They knew what gold was, and they didn't consider it important to our livelihoods, to our life. Practiced, you're going out and you're gathering your foods, practicing your ceremonies, your culture. It's not integral to that. And so what does it say, when the practice of a culture is that's its center, gets us to where we are in this, specific colonial moment, perhaps. But I just wanted to point out this relationality to that political kind of moment and content and difference in kind of, philosophy around that.
So do you think we need to curate an exhibit on comparative notions of wealth?
Yes.
Does our curation need to be more comparative? I don't know. I think that's a really important observation. And, to Candace's really important question, what will change people's minds? Do we need to focus on that? What is it? Because here we are with these sort of cultural vessels that are tens of thousands of years old. We've made the decision to stay together as Tuscarora or as peoples from any of the communities that we have come from, and so the first thing we need to, I think, ask ourselves is, did we really make that decision, or did we have to stay together after contact, And I would say, I think our people, at least in the case of Tuscarora, we did decide, well, we're going to stay together as a cultural formation, because we had every opportunity to just disband and become a peoples who dissipated, who it would have been so easy, I think, not easy, but it would have been so, traumatic. I could easily have been one of these peoples today who has this memory of, oh, my ancestors said they were Tuscarora. I could definitely have been one of those peoples. And we have a lot of those peoples amongst us who come from spaces where their families left a long time ago and they're struggling to come back. And so I think there's lots of really important work going on, and this is some of the work, right? About why we made the choices we made and how we're going to do it. And so maybe we need to ask ourselves like really difficult questions around our practices, And I don't know if they can be open sessions, so I think it might be better to do it more privately.
Yes, yeah.
In safe ways. I think we need to ask each other harder questions. It's very difficult to do criticism on Indigenous art, right? Because I think we want to be affirmative, we want to be positive, Yeah. And so, but doing sort of like critical analysis of where we're going in a constructive way is a really valued skill, I think, that we need to sharpen, be better at, because it will make us all better.
Yeah, the discussion is reminding me of the importance of critical and curatorial writing that discusses perhaps the process versus just the end exhibition, in terms of pointing to these acts of care and labor that are so intertwined with the working.
Yeah, for me, it's all about that process, because I have to say that, it's like I'm very cautious even about how I discuss my work with what I think of as co-creators, the Kyuga people, because it's a very delicate relationship of permissions, and uh, and so uh, none of this work is easy. That's, I guess, the thing that I don't have to tell you that, but none of it is easy. And I don't think it should be, because there's a lot at stake in how these ideas play out.
Well, I want to thank you again, Jolene. I know that we're running into the last half hour from your talk, and I'm conscious of time and our attention and being drawn into this online. So
Yeah.
you offered so much in your discussion and in conversation. And we have some other thank yous happening in the chat from Scott. Thank you so much for your wisdom, care, and attention, kindness, and knowledge. And I want to, again, just really thank you for also pointing to that, the call to be cautious, to be critical, to have these kinds of conversations within and to each other, and that those have been sustained also by, of course, many generations before us who are continuing to work with these philosophies and ways that are
Yeah.
brought forward by our ancestors, and that we owe at least a bit of that effort and commitment to what it takes to have those here today.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the time and for listening to some of my thoughts, and for your conversation as well. I look forward to learning more from you as well, and appreciate the work that you're doing too.
Well, we were so very excited that you could make it here with us, Jolene, and thank you again. I've got a train going behind, so sorry about that distraction of train sound.
We better go. The train is leaving the station. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. And we look forward to following your people can read those texts we mentioned in your bio, and much of your other work. And I hope to see that beautiful garden blossom throughout the summer.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Nyawa.